Hello, I'm Brian Goulet of the Goulet Pen Company, and I'm here for my 18th episode of Goulet Q&A. This is my weekly kind of laid-back Q&A session where I'll have a topic, a theme based on something, sometimes nothing, and you just ask me questions in all my different media channels and I put it all into a video here for you. So it's a little more laid-back style, not changing, hand shots and stuff like that. But anyway. So here I am, my 18th one, kind of got the drill down now, back into kind of a regular routine after kind of skipping a few weeks in the holidays. I did an open forum last week, and this week I actually have a theme that I selected called the Trifecta of pen, paper, and ink. So got a lot of good questions. A lot of them came from Facebook this week, so that was kind of neat. Let's see here. Last week I had brought up the idea of possibly moving the publishing of the Q&A to Saturday. Just wanted to gauge how everybody would feel about that. Didn't know how much I was ingrained in everyone's Friday routine or not. Just because, I wanted to explore my logistical options. And most people didn't care, some people really did. So I'm not gonna change it anytime soon. I just wanted to know, kind of get a pulse of how everybody felt about it. So as of right now, I'm gonna keep it on Fridays. So no big deal there. Also, I've been working a lot on videos, blogging, stuff like that. Got a decent little backlog, but I've also got a lot of other logistical things around the company here that I'm focusing on. So I don't think I'm going to step up the video production in terms of quantity for the time being. I'm going to kind of keep it. I like to try to do like 3 videos a week. So maybe like a Q&A and then a couple of other videos. I was trying to shoot for like 4 or 5 videos a week, and that's just really tough with everything else I got going on here. So I think 3 a week, maybe 2 to 3 a week is going to be a good number for me for now, for the time being. There's a lot of just other things going on here, so I want to make sure I'm giving it my full attention as I do it. So that said, I got a lot of questions here. I ended up getting, like 19 pretty solid questions. I'm going to just roll through them, and I'm going to see how well I can answer all these questions. Got a lot of good ones. So first, let me explain kind of what the whole Trifecta pen, paper, and ink is. If you're a fountain pen fan, you've used them a lot, you probably know a little what I'm talking about. But if you're not familiar with fountain pens, you've got a fountain pen which uses a liquid ink and you write on paper. So all 3 of those interact with each other to affect, how quick an ink is going to dry, what the color looks like, how smooth it's going to feel when you write, whether it's going to bleed through onto the other side of the page or not. And all of these things are kind of influenced by each other. So I'm going to elaborate on a lot of this stuff, and I got some good questions here. I'm trying to stick to questions that really kind of relate to different aspects of stuff together, but we'll see how it goes. So the first question I have is from @PepWaves03 on Twitter, and you said, why does paper affect fountain pens more so than rollerballs? So the first thing I would do is I would send you to watch my video, my Fountain Pen 101 video on how does a fountain pen work. Because in that I talk about ballpoints, rollerballs, and fountain pens and kind of what makes them different. But to kind of summarize that video, basically a ballpoint pen uses a paste ink, which is a much thicker ink. A rollerball uses a gel ink, which is thinner than the paste, but the thinnest is a fountain pen, which uses water. And so that is going to be the thinnest of the 3. And because you are using a thinner ink than the other ones, the paper, the absorbency, the sizing, the coating, whatever you want to call it, that matters more for a fountain pen ink than it does for a rollerball or for a for a ballpoint ink. So that's why fountain pen people care so much more about the paper than just about anybody else. And in the US anyway, most of our paper is like inkjet paper that's pretty absorbent, and paper quality is not necessarily much of a priority. So fountain pen people end up having to deal with non-ideal paper more in the US than they might in other fountain pen cultures like in Europe and Japan and other parts of Asia and stuff like that. So it's really all about the viscosity of the ink. Myke N on Facebook said, Goulet Pens has the package sets from specific employees for sale. What is it about those sets that the individual likes about them to make it their daily carry? And what is their reason for carrying them? And if possible, could they tell us in the video? Logistically, I just wasn't able to pull anybody here. I'm actually under the gun. Normally I try and shoot this video on Thursday so that I have time to do all that, but I was out of town like all day Wednesday, was really behind yesterday, Thursday, so I'm actually shooting this kind of late on Friday morning, so if I end up publishing this late, that's why. So I just don't have time to go pulling everybody off and do that. I don't have the luxury of time with Q&A videos usually. So anyway, but why do people choose what they do? Okay, so it's not something we just arbitrarily made up. And honestly, some of the choices, we're looking around at each other like, really? That's your favorite? And we kind of give each other a hard time. So basically, it's all pretty much based on their personal experience. So if you're new into our Goulet family here, one of the first things you do is, well, obviously you're learning your job, learning the ropes. So we offer you a pen. You know, you get a free fountain pen to kind of get you into it, because pretty much nobody, almost nobody that we've ever hired here has any clue what a fountain pen even is, really. It's just not, you know, that's not a prerequisite for being here, because we know that you're going to get obsessed soon enough. So we want you to work with the products and handle them and try different things out, and then everybody gets to pick a pen for themselves. They also get, you know, essentially an unlimited supply of ink and paper and stuff like that, because paper sometimes we'll have notebooks, the corners will be crunched and stuff like that, and we'll let people take notebooks and people buy stuff for themselves. But you know, they get essentially unlimited ink samples as well, so they get to try kind of just whatever inks they want. Perks of the job. So, you know, it's really just a matter of, you know, everybody's getting a pen. They're really just curious because they're handling this stuff every day. They get into it themselves. You know, our admins, they're writing notes like all the time, so they're really just kind of into it. So it's really just kind of everybody uses it and sees what they like the best, and that's kind of how it ends up happening, you know, based on really just kind of handling it all themselves. And they're pretty fortunate being here that they get to touch and feel and write with a lot of different stuff. And we all have different pens, and we all write with each other's pens and stuff like that. So that's pretty much where that comes from. AJ Rosati on YouTube said, what pen or pens, ink and notebook do you carry and use daily? I know I always have a custom 74, Lamy 2000, and a Lamy All-Star with me. The only ink I always have is diamine Syrah in my All-Star. The other two change a great deal. Notebook is always a Midori passport size. Okay, so yeah, you got good taste, man. That's awesome. You got similar taste to me. So okay, so I have a video on Ink Nouveau called Brian Goulet's Top 3 Daily Carry Fountain Pens. And in there I talk about my love for the medium nib custom 74 in blue, of course. The Lamy 2000, and I gotta slow down when I'm talking about products here, because I did get a couple of comments from some newer folks that said when I really get on a roll and I'm rattling off product names and product codes and stuff they're not familiar with, it gets confusing. So I'll try to slow down. So custom 74, Pilot custom 74 with a medium nib. That's one of my favorites. I have a Lamy 2000. I actually have a couple of them now because I just recently acquired one with an oblique medium nib, which is actually not as drastic a difference from the regular one. They're actually discontinuing the oblique medium, but I was still able to get one because, you know, I was able to pull some strings over at Lamy. So the Lamy 2000, big fan of that one. I got it in a medium as well as an oblique medium. And then Lamy All-Star, I've got that with every nib size. You know, love my blue All-Star. I've actually got quite a few All-Stars. I've been kind of collecting them for a while. So I'm a big fan of that one too. I like the Pilot Metropolitan, big fan. The Jinhao X750, been carrying that one around for a little while. Love it. The Sparkle Pen, Sparkling Sands, that one's cool. And then I've got a Delta Fusion 82. That one I'll carry around with me a lot. That's kind of like my bling pen. So if I got to go to a fancy schmancy schmoozing networking kind of thing, as the CEO of the company, I will usually wear my fancy suit, which maybe I'll break that out one of these days. And then I will have my, Fusion 82 or something in blue, of course. That I'll use with that. So those are some of my tops. For inks, I like Noodler's Black, Liberty's Elysium, big fan of that one. Pilot Iroshizuku Konpeki, love that blue. I got a thing for blue, obviously. If you don't know anything about me, know that I love blue. Diamine Red Dragon, I'm a big fan of that ink. I just like that kind of punchy red. But Syrah is nice too. I like Syrah too, AJ. Noodler's Apache Sunset, just because that thing shades like crazy. I do love to carry around a Midori Passport Traveler's Notebook. I keep 3 notebooks in there, and the way that I end up using it is I put 3 in there originally because I had 1 graph, 1 lined, and 1 blank, and I was thinking, oh, maybe the different rulings, I don't even actually care much about the rulings. For me, it's more about just having the 3 different notebooks, so I will use them for different purposes. I'll carry it around with me everywhere. So one of them I end up using for kind of a business notebook. So it's, you know, if I'm going to meet with someone and I want to take some notes, they're telling me about a business contact, I'll write it down in that notebook. The other one will be one that I'll bring to church with me, or if I'm, you know, reading anything, and so it's more of a spiritual kind of notebook. And then the last one is really kind of more of a personal thing. So if I have just like random ideas that pop in my head, or if I have anything that I think about with my kids or anything like that, I will write down in that one. So that's how I end up using that. It works out really well. Let's see here. What else did you ask me about? Oh, I also like the Clairefontaine top wire bound, you know, in like the 5x8 size, you know, it's not exactly 5x8, but I can't remember the exact dimensions now. I like that to just write down ideas and stuff. And then Rhodia number 16 dot pad, I always have one of those around. I don't really carry that around with me as much, but I more just kind of keep one of those like at my desk. I keep one at home, and that's good when just like writing down lists and you want to tear it off, take it with you. So there you go. Joshua P. on Facebook said, I'd like to start a daily journal. What pen, ink, and paper should I consider? More specifically, what notebook should I use that will last a long time and doesn't let ink show on the reverse side? What ink should I consider or stay away from? And should I use or stay away from a pen that lays down ink really wet? Okay, yes, a lot of questions there. Joshua, so that's totally cool. I'll do my best here. So what should you consider? So you want to, you probably, if this is going to be a daily journal, you know, this is probably something that you're going to want to stick around for a while. You're going to want to, whatever you end up choosing, make sure that the paper is archival quality, you know, pH neutral, acid free, and bleach free if possible. Those are usually the best. That means the paper is they're going to hold up, going to be around for a long time. It's not going to break down in storage after a while. The ink itself doesn't really matter as much. You can get a permanent ink if you want to, you know, have it be, you know, permanent. But really, if you're storing it properly and it's out of sunlight and, you know, it's not getting wet, then you're going to be fine with most fountain pen inks. You know, going with a pH neutral ink is good, but they don't always advertise whether they are or not. So, you know, so as far as ink, it's kind of just whatever you use. I wouldn't really sweat the ink as much, but, you know, if you want something like Noodler's Black or something, you know, really permanent, bulletproof, whatever, that's never a bad idea. Let's see here. What do you last long time? It doesn't let ink show on the reverse side. So I like Clairefontaine, you know, Clairefontaine Basics, maybe the wire bounds. But if you're storing it, wire bound might not be the best. Depends if you're using it as like an ink journal versus, you know, something that you want to leave to your grandkids kind of thing. You may want to go with a bound journal like a Quo Vadis Habana or a Rhodia Web notebook. I like both of those. Really good paper in both of those. You could also look to do it on just loose leaf paper. You know, I don't carry much of that stuff, but if you've got, you know, an office supply store nearby, you can go with a HP laser jet or premium paper. You know, that stuff is usually pretty good. And then you can always get that bound after the fact. So if you're working on like a big epic project, you know, I know a lot of people will transcribe, you know, entire books and stuff like that. They may go that route just because then you don't have to worry about storing like volumes of bound journals. And then, yeah, that's probably about it. So should you use or stay away from a pen that lays down ink really wet? Might not be the worst idea. That's really going to be kind of a personal preference. I would experiment before you get full on into your journaling. Maybe just play around on some notebooks and stuff like that, you know, scribble in the back or, you know, something like that, and just kind of see how it's going to work for you before you go all in buying like 20 notebooks that you're going to use as a volume for your life's story. Hopefully that helps you out. So Pascal D on Facebook said, nice Rhodia fountain pen friendly paper is cool for letters and hobbies. Nice feel, no bleed through, etc. You know, is there an office paper and ink combo you'd recommend with minimal bleed and feather and dry time? I guess we can just try, and with time we'll see, but if you already have suggestions, it could save time and ink smears and transfers. As we probably won't have access to the same paper brands, what weight, brightness, characteristics should we look for? Okay, so you got a lot packed in there, but basically you're asking me what kind of office paper should you get. So the best office paper that I personally have ever tried is the HP, what is it called, 32-pound premium. I think it's just called 32-pound premium or premium laser or something like that. That stuff's great. It's pretty expensive, you know, it's like 18 or 20 bucks a ream, which is 500 sheets. But that's, you know, it seems expensive compared to like the $5 you might spend on a ream of terrible stuff. But it's really thick, really ink resistant, smooth. You know, it's pretty much the best loose leaf stuff, loose leaf office paper that I've found. There's HP makes a 24-pound laser jet, that's what we use here in the Goulet office. It's much more economical, but it still holds up pretty darn well. If you write a lot, maybe go with the 24-pound stuff. If you don't write as much and you want like the best stuff that you can find, that premium 32-pound stuff is pretty darn good. But if you're gonna be shopping around, you know, I have no affiliation with HP. I don't even sell this stuff, so whatever, do whatever you want. But I would say that I've used some other stuff that's called like the premium laser, and nothing really worked as well as that. You know, I've used like some Office Max brand stuff or Office Depot, whatever, and I forget the other, like Georgia Pacific, and they just didn't do as well for me. But you know, you can always try it yourself. You pretty much have to like buy a whole ream of this stuff to try it though. So I have like 4 or 5 reams of 499 sheets of office paper I'm like never going to use. But anyway, so okay, where was I going with that? I'm really kind of loopy today. So yeah, if you're going to be shopping around with different brands or whatever, stick with, you know, anything that's got the name premium in it. It might be a good start, but definitely go with laser paper instead of inkjet paper. Inkjet's made to be absorbent. It's made to absorb paper and dry quickly, but you don't want that because it's going to feather and bleed and stuff like crazy. So go with the laser jet because it's more resistant. And then, you know, you pretty much get what you pay for. So if you buy much more expensive stuff, it's not always a guarantee it's going to be better, but it's probably going to be better. If the paper is 4 times the price, it's probably going to be at least mildly better than the $5 ream stuff. So there you go. Carlos Q on Facebook, you said, why Rhodia paper is considered better than Clairefontaine paper. Okay, why is Rhodia paper considered better than Clairefontaine paper when writing with fountain pens? Both papers are produced by the same company. Is there a difference in price? And definitely, oh, there is a difference in price, and definitely there's a difference when writing. I use the same pen and the same ink, Lamy 2000 with diamine forest green, and the difference is huge when writing on both notebooks. Why is this? Both papers are ink resistant and high quality. Yeah, so they're both owned by, you know, the same, they're both made by, you know, Clairefontaine, but they haven't always been that way. I think Clairefontaine bought Rhodia back in 1997. Which actually seems like longer ago now than it used to when I first got into this business, but not that it's really been that long. But anyway, so, you know, Rhodia has been around since the 30s, I think, so 1930s. So they were doing their own thing a long time before Clairefontaine and them ever linked up. So I think, you know, they came around, and yeah, even though they're manufactured, but they're made on separate machines. They have a little bit separate process. So I don't know exactly what that process is, but I know that the Rhodia paper is used on a completely separate set of machines that gives it that kind of little bit different feel than the Clairefontaine paper. Most Clairefontaine paper that I can think of is 90 gram, and the Rhodia, the regular stuff, the non-premium Rhodia is 80 grams. So the paper thickness itself is a little bit different. But most people tend to associate Rhodia as being better because it's not as slick as the Clairefontaine. It's still very slick by most paper standards, but the Clairefontaine paper is that much slicker. And some people love that, like me. Other people, they're not as crazy about it. And the Rhodia stuff feels really slick, but it's not like, you know, writing on a hot butter stick on glass. That's a weird analogy, but I'm just trying to think of the slickest things I possibly could. Clairefontaine's pretty slick, and Rhodia is not quite as slick, so a lot of people prefer it that way. You know, it's really kind of a personal preference thing. And the dry time on Clairefontaine is usually just a little bit longer because you've got that slicker, more ink-resistant kind of thing going on. And then you've got the formats as well. So, you know, the format will make a difference. Clairefontaine, you don't have as many options for like a perforated tablet type thing. They do make some top staple bounds similar to the Rhodia, but it is a little bit more expensive. Partly because of the thicker paper and the way they finish it and stuff like that. But Rhodia, you know, they're mainly known for the tablet format, and which I know I end up using that probably on a little bit more regular basis than I do any of the Clairefontaine notebooks, just because, you know, in an office setting for me here or at home when I'm writing grocery lists or whatever, you know, the tablet thing is nice. You can tear off the sheet and you can just kind of go on using it. Plus, Rhodia's got the dots. Love me some Rhodia dot pads. That's like a huge winner for me. So a lot of it's just preference, but you know, they're both great papers. Kevin L. on Facebook, you said, here's a mystery for the Goulet Q&A to contemplate. Is there any explanation when using the same paper and ink but different pens of different manufacturers that the ink color can vary from the color on the bottle to darker shades of the same color? So I think you're asking, like, why is the pen, if that's the only difference, why is the pen making a difference into how the ink actually looks? Okay, so you've basically got two different things that could be happening, but it all comes down to ink volume, the flow, how much ink is being put on the page. That's what's making the difference, because you've got this water-based ink that's got water and it's got dye in it. And the more dye it has in it, the darker it's going to look, and the more saturated and vibrant the color is going to be. The lighter it is, the more watered down and non-vibrant it's going to be. So if you're putting down, like keeping on that same concept, it's all about the dye, right? So the more dye you're putting down into one place, the darker it's going to look. So think about that in terms of when you're writing. If you've got a pen that's writing much wetter, it's putting down more ink on the page, it's going to appear darker in color than it would on a pen that's stingier in the ink flow. Now that could be because of the feed. If the feed's really open and it just gushes ink out of that pen, that could mean that it's putting down more ink and it's going to look darker. Or it could be because of the size of the tip of the nib. So if you're using an extra fine and it's drawing this teeny little line, it's not going to look necessarily as dark as if you have this big fat broad nib and it's just putting out a wide swath of ink on the page. Now some of that's going to depend on the ink itself. Some inks will have different flow characteristics and whatnot. Some inks will be more saturated than others and may have the tendency to shade or change colors, shift colors more so than others. Some, like I'm thinking about like Noodler's Black, that really doesn't shade much at all. If you use that in an extra fine or use that in a paintbrush, it's not going to look much different because black is black is black in that ink. Whereas if you're using something like Noodler's Apache Sunset, really light, it can look almost like a light yellow, and really dark, it can be like this deep red or orange. And that changes quite a bit based on how much ink is on the page. But that is essentially what's happening. It's all about the flow and the volume of ink that's being put down. And okay, so John N. on Facebook, you said, why are brown inks more prone to feathering in pens on any paper? Give it a try with Noodler's Polar Brown. That's what you said. So, John, well, I'm not sure that it's a universal truth that all brown inks feather more than all other inks. I think it really just depends. I haven't specifically tested out like one color of ink to see if it has feathering characteristics different than other colors. What I will say is that Polar Brown, yeah, that's going to feather, but if you look at Polar Blue, you know, and Polar Green, they're all going to feather more than any of their other respective colors too. So I think specifically related to Polar Brown, that's more of an aspect of that ink property than it is about the color. So Polar Brown, you know, it's a permanent ink. It's lubricated, so it's going to flow wetter, which is going to make it have more of a tendency to feather and bleed. And it's also got some other property in it that is going to give it freezing resistance. I'm not even sure how that impacts the flow and the feathering and stuff like that. But that is just kind of a unique ink, and if you like the characteristics of it, or if you need that freeze resistance, you know, that is there for you. You know, but I'm not sure it would be fair to say that all browns feather, because I don't believe that that's the truth. However, I will say that, you know, when you're mixing fountain pen inks, there are some pure dyes and there are some that are mixtures in order to achieve certain colors. And I'm no chemist by any means, and I barely can scratch the surface when it comes to ink chemistry and mixing and stuff like that. But I do know that, you know, different dye components will have different characteristics to them in terms of how they might flow or write or their saturation, stuff like that. So that is undeniably a factor in how an ink might perform. Now, I believe that ink makers will compensate for that with lubrication and other various chemicals to try to counterbalance out some of the natural tendencies of the dyes. And I'm officially speaking outside of my knowledge now, so I will stop right there. But just know that it is entirely possible that the raw components that make up certain colors could have certain universal characteristics to them. But there's no blanket statement you can make to say, all this color ink will always act this way. Sherah on Facebook said, pen, paper, and ink. In your opinion, which is the most important of the three, and which is the least important of the three, and why? Boy, this is like a high school English question right here, and why? Okay, so what is most important? The pen, the paper, and the ink are all extremely important. They really are, and they all impact everything. And part of my original motivation, let me give you a little backstory here. When I started the Goulet Pen Company with my wife, I was originally a pen maker, and when I started to open up the possibility of retailing, you know, not craftsmanship, making my pens kind of thing, but like the online retailing side of the business, which is now, you know, pretty much everything I do. You know, I looked around at what other competitors, benchmark companies, whatever you want to call them, were doing, you know, people who sold pens. And I saw that the pens were pretty much everybody's focus. There was very, very little focus on ink and on paper. And for the first year and a half, pretty much, Rachel and I, we focused really heavily on the paper and the ink and didn't even deal with pens pretty much at all. In fact, there was probably an 8-month period in the earliest days of the Goulet Pen Company where we were the Goulet Pen Company and gouletpens.com, and we didn't sell a single pen. So it was a little weird, and I think I even blogged about that one time. I was like, should we change our name because we don't carry pens? Or maybe should we carry pens because this doesn't make sense? Anyway, funny now looking back on it because you look at our site today and it's like pens all over the place. But you know, pens are so much of the focus, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The pens themselves, you know, you got the aesthetic thing, it's very visceral, you get to touch it, and there's just a lot of aspects to the pen that are very appealing. But I think it's an overemphasized part of the importance of the overall writing experience. Now, that's not to say that the pen itself is not the sole important factor for some people, because honestly, there are people out there who collect pens, who like fountain pens that they will buy that they will never write with. So for them, paper and ink is of absolutely no importance. So I think that's why the pen tends to get heavier weighted, just because there's a lot more that can go into the pen, and it's very tangible. You know, you look at a pen, you got the artistry, the design, the ink capacity, all that kind of stuff, you know, all that can influence what you want in a pen. When you get into ink and paper, it's like a lot more nitty-gritty, and even with ink, it's like it gets really ambiguous as to what's going on because it's not as documented as to what's actually in it than it is with a pen. So that said, I like the analogy of, you know, if you're driving a car, what is more important, the engine, the gasoline, or the tires? If you take any one of those away, you're not really going to get very far. But as to which is most important, of course, if you have a different engine or use different type of fuel or you change up your tires drastically, that will affect your driving performance and your driving experience. But as to which one is most important, I think you could have people that would argue any of them. And it's the same thing with pen, ink, and paper. So to break it down a little bit, I'm not going to give you a firm answer as to which one I think is most important there. But for the pens, I would say the pens are what everyone not everyone, but most people perceive to be the most important. It's the most tangible. It's right there. Usually, when you get into fountain pens, you don't think, oh yeah, I really got to nail the ink down. I'll figure out the pen later, but it's the ink and the paper I really need to nail down. No, of course not. When you get into the fountain pen hobby, it's called the fountain pen hobby. It's not called the ink and paper writing with a fountain pen hobby. It's a fountain pen hobby, you know what I mean? So the fountain pen, I think, is what's most important for most people. However, the ink is actually the easiest to change and the easiest to kind of influence your writing experience. So if you have a pen, you're pretty much going to already have a pen. If you get into the hobby, you're going to buy a pen and it's like, okay, I've got my pen. I've made my decision, I've got my pen. Your paper, usually you're surrounded by paper in your world, or you're at work or you're wherever, and you may not even have the luxury of choosing your paper. So that is like, okay, well, it is what it is. And most people don't even think about paper. So it's like, okay, I've got my pen. Now I need an ink. Okay, what do I get? What the heck kind of ink do I get? It's kind of like, I equated in the early days of ink being like wine. It's like, okay, if you're not into wine and you go into a winery and you're just like wandering around, it's like, I don't know which one to pick. It's kind of the same thing with fountain pen ink. It's like, I don't know what makes all these different. Why are some of them $40 and some of them $7? I don't know. And then you look at the colors and you're like, well, that blue looks like that blue looks like that blue. Why are these all different? There are a lot of differences. I'm not going to get all into that today because I'm already taking way too long to get through all these questions. But so that said, you can pretty drastically change your overall writing experience just by changing the ink. And even within the ink, you can dilute it, you can do other things to it to change that ink itself. So that the ink is the quickest, easiest, cheapest thing that you can change without having to uproot, sell and buy a new pen or drastically change your paper, which is sometimes the hardest to change. The ink is the easiest thing to kind of tweak. So, but it's also the most mystical. The inks, you can sometimes get properties like permanent or lubricated, but you're never really going to get a kind of scientific ruling of, oh, the ink flow, the viscosity of this ink is 0.21, I don't know. But so there's so much more subjectivity to the ink and how it's going to perform. And the ink is affected by the pen and the paper drastically. Ink by itself doesn't really do anything for you. It really only matters in the context of pen and paper. Paper, you can at least like touch it or crinkle it or make an airplane or something, out of it. And a pen, you can just like hold it or, you can poke people with it or whatever you want to do. But ink by itself, you can't drink it. You can smell it, I guess, but it's usually not pleasant. It really doesn't do anything aside from being used. I mean, I guess you could paint with it or throw it on somebody, but oh man, I'm getting loopy. I'm also getting thirsty. Would you mind if I take a sip of water? Would that be okay? I'm gonna go a little long on this one, so, forgive me. Okay, so thank you, I appreciate that. So yeah, the ink is the easiest to change, but it's also the most mystical. You're gonna experiment more with ink than you will with probably anything else. And then paper, I think, is the most overlooked. It's kind of like, going back to the car analogy, it's like if you're driving a Ferrari versus a dump truck, the paper is kind of like the road that you're driving on, So if you're driving on a gravel road versus a racetrack, your Ferrari is going to feel very different on the two of those things. So paper, it's kind of like the road in that most people don't really think about it. They just drive on it. But it can really make a difference in how your overall writing experience is. So paper is something that usually people get into pens, then they discover inks, and then to kind of get to that next degree, it's like, oh, the paper can really make a difference too. Paper is kind of like the third degree of the fountain pen hobby. So as to which one's most important though, that's going to be up to you. So there's an extremely long answer, but a thorough one, I feel. Jamie M. on Facebook, you said, what papers are best for wetter pens and inks in order to have it bleed less and keep it at its thinnest line possible? I can't think if there's a better word than line there. Okay, yeah, that's a good word. That's very common. When you're writing down, it's the line you're putting down, sure. Okay, so you're asking about paper. What's a good paper for really wet ink or pen? So, there's obviously brands that you can look at. Brands, excuse me. Sometimes they're hit or miss. You know, Clairefontaine and Rhodia are pretty darn consistent. Some other brands, it really depends. You know, paper is a natural product. It's either going to be made from wood pulp or cotton or some other kind of, you know, recycled something or other. So there is a natural component to it, depending on how the stuff is sourced out, how it's made, what types of stuff is used in the manufacturing process. It could vary from batch to batch to batch if the consistency is not taken as a priority, which is why usually when you have economical paper choices, cheaper paper choices, usually they're going to get a more varied experience, you know, from one batch to another. So that said, if you are shopping for paper, it's good to go with paper that has kind of a reputation for being good with fountain pens, which is why Clairefontaine and Rhodia kind of are the cream that rise to the top. And I discovered that early on, before I even knew what fountain pens were. I'd already heard that Clairefontaine and Rhodia were pretty much tops, and they've been that way ever since. They were that way long before I came along. Of course, it's a little subjective. It's not the best for everybody, and I'm always biased because I sell the stuff, but I sell other stuff too, and I still think Clairefontaine and Rhodia is the best for me anyway. So if you're shopping for paper, look at the weight, the grams per square meter, the GM2 or whatever you want to call it. That's a place to start. It's not the best indicator because you can have thin paper that performs really well. You can have thick paper that totally sucks. But it's a place to start. Usually you want to get something like 80 gram or above. That's pretty much a good start. Go down to 70, you can get some good 70. Below 70, it's like exceptional. You know, like to be like some of the Midori's got some really thin paper. Tomo River out of Japan, I've heard that's pretty good, and it's super thin. You know, like Japanese rice paper and stuff. That's really thin. That stuff works really well, but typically paper that thin does not perform very well at all. 70 is like the minimum of what you're going to want before you even look at anything. Of course, paper's not always advertised with its thickness either, but you know, once you start handling some paper, you'll be able to tell generally how thick it is by touching it and stuff like that. But 80 gram, 90 gram, that's kind of like the sweet spot for where most fountain pen paper tends to be. Going much thicker than that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to help with bleeding or feathering. It might help with show through, like on the back, you know, and being able to see ghosting or whatever you want to call it. It might help there, but it won't necessarily make that much of a difference. It's more the coating that's put on the paper as to how well it'll resist feathering and bleeding. And if you go much thicker, you're getting into like cardstock type thickness, and then it becomes almost impractical to put into a notebook or a notepad or whatever. And then, okay, so you want stuff that feels pretty slick. So if you're touching the paper, if you're able to touch the paper yourself, if you're feeling it and it feels really kind of rough, then it's not necessarily an indicator it's going to perform poorly with fountain pens, but it probably will. Just as a broad generalization, the slicker it is, the better the chance that it might perform well with fountain pen ink. And then lastly, you know, try to stick with stuff that is made in locations where fountain pens are more prevalent in society. So, you know, France and the UK, Japan, you know, different parts of Asia may or may not be, you know, that is really kind of broad as well. But, you know, I find that most of the best paper comes from those more fountain pen type cultures, just because they appreciate paper quality more so than, like, especially here in the US. And then lastly, just kind of look for reviews online. The thing about paper is that, you know, a lot of different people will do reviews and stuff of paper, and there's not an infinite possibility of paper. You know, to manufacture different types of paper takes a lot of resources. So, you know, there's a lot of different types of fountain pen ink, and there's just tons of pens. But when you're looking for paper, yeah, there's a lot of paper out there, but generally you'll see that as far as like really good paper, it's not as broad a spectrum as you might suspect. Okay, that was 10 questions, and I still got some to go. All right, I'm gonna try and wrap it up. I already took notes on all these and everything. I already prepared them all, so I'm gonna try and get going. So, you know, go ahead and pour yourself another cup of coffee or whatever. Pause it, come back to this, go exercise or something. Grab an apple or celery. Those are my favorite treats.